We will be starting with our next session, and this session talks about the trillion-dollar space economy, projections, methodologies, and market reality. Global projections estimate the space economy could exceed 1 trillion in coming decades. Yet, methodologies, definitions, and assumptions vary widely across institutes and markets. This session will examine how major estimates are derived, what constitutes the space economy, where value creation is expected to emerge, and how India's projected growth trajectory should be understood in the absence of standardized sector classification frameworks. I invite on stage our chair and moderator, Mr. Ganesh Mohan, Deputy Director in Space, the speakers, Mr.Rainer, Partner and MD Novaspace, Mr.Nakulan Narayanan, Associate Director Deloitte, Mr. Himanshu Suryavanshi, Associate Partner KPMG, Mr. Divesh Dhawan, Director EY. I request the delegates to keep your mobile phones on silent and to minimize movement during the session. For any assistance, you can reach out to the SIA-INDIA volunteers. I also request all the speakers to keep their remarks concise and within the allocated time. I now hand over the proceedings to the moderator. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There's a thing about sitting on a panel with 4 consultants, right? And we are speaking about the trillion-dollar space economy. So hopefully by the end of the session, we'll know whether we are at 1 trillion, 2 trillion, or as they would like to say, it depends, right? So welcome to this panel discussion on the trillion-dollar space economy, projections, methodologies, and market reality. So I did not reinforce that the space sector, including India, is witnessing an unprecedented optimism, and so I think the topic is quite relevant to the state where we are in, and India also, I'll speak about it a bit, is undertaking an exercise to measure and create a sustained framework for measuring space economy and its contribution to the national GDP. So beyond this headline, there's a very important question, that is, what exactly do we mean by space economy, right? I mean, if you go to take a measurement of the space economy, it's not as simple as it sounds, because you have the upstream, which is where you speak about manufacturing and the launch vehicles and satellites, and then there is the downstream, which is where the applications come in, and then there are most importantly the R&D part of it, like how do something like the lunar activity contribute to space economy, how do these derived applications contribute to space economy. So these are pretty important questions that we will try to look into today. So to discuss these in a conversational mode, I have a very eminent panel of 4 people. Please join me in giving a huge round of applause. Mr. Nakulan, AD Deloitte, Mr. Himanshu, KPMG, Mr.Rainer, Partner and MD Novaspace, and Mr. Divesh Dhawan from EY. So what I broadly thought is, I did touch upon the effort that we are undertaking at InSpace to bring a structural framework to the way the Indian space economy is growing. So I'll just give a small brief, a minute or two, taking due consideration to the time and that you're all waiting for the lunch. And then I'll be taking them through a bit of questions, broadly covering definition of space economy, measurement and forecasting, then the market reality, and future opportunities, and taking some guidance from them as to what we should be looking at Indian space sector measurement. So broadly, I'm sure many of you would have heard of this decadal vision that we have set at InSpace, where we are targeting a space economy of around $44 billion in the next decade, around by 2033. We did a first cut measurement in 2022, which sort of gave us a number of $8.4 billion as the valuation of Indian space economy right now. So then, 3 years have passed, and now, we are in the process of measuring where we are now, over the past 3 years. So we have sort of brought out a framework through which we are collecting data from the companies, and I'm sure many of you might have gotten calls from InSpace, many of you would be getting. So that is an exercise which we are, or I am rather taking this forum to sincerely urge your support in helping us with. So broadly, we know that there is a lack of a proper unified definition of space sector. It varies between institutes, it varies between countries. So that, along with the relatively small size and the dispersed nature of it right now, is some of the main challenges we are facing. So what we basically did is we formed a joint working group, which is headed by InSpace and has members from industry associations like SIA, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, which for Rainer particularly, that's the body which measures the space, measures the GDP and the relevant numbers in India. Then we have members from the Department of Space, Department of Telecom, etc., where they came up with a broad definition of space sector and a structured methodology as to how we approach it. So that's an exercise which we are undertaking right now. So basically, under this National Industrial Classification (NIC), we have identified around 137 activities pertaining to space sector, and we have sent questionnaires, a bit tough or bit time-consuming set of questionnaires, if I would use that, with the companies, and obviously the first few efforts, were not the most welcoming, if I may humbly admit, but now we're trying to simplify it. We have identified a person who would be, working with each one of you and try to help get that data. So I'm leaving with a bit of a snippet. We have gotten in touch with around 350 old companies, around 100 have given us data, through which, we are we have estimated the total revenue in India around 3,800, 3,900 crores. Total investments around 5,000 crores, out of which around 1,200 odd is FDI, and around 6,000 employees in the space sector. So why I said this number, it is to convey the importance of having this measurement. So for example, if you know this percentage of space is contributing to the national GDP, and then you go before a budget session and tell that, look, I'm doing this better, I would need more benefits that would be, beneficial, or that would be transferred to the industry. So to convey that importance is why I gave you these snippets. So once again, using this forum to sincerely urge all of you to support, and that's about it. I'll be asking each of them a question in the structure that I mentioned, and we are eating into the lunchtime, so the ball is up in the air, gentlemen. Thank you. Right, so I thought I'll start with you, Nakulan, before discussing all the so-called trillion-dollar projection. So I thought I'll hear from you as to how do you define basically a space sector, what are the activities that we should include, and where do you draw the boundary, or rather a porous boundary between space and space-enabled economy. And I'm particularly asking you because I know you did a study a couple of years back on the exact same topic, which, I suppose it did in some sense become a base of a lot many assumptions and statistics. So over to you.
Thanks, Ganesh. Thanks to SIA for having us here. I think we stand between people and lunch, so I'll try to keep it as brisk and brief as possible. Right? The simplest answer to all of it is that you have 4 consultants on the dais, right? The answer is, how much do you want this to be, right? So, jokes aside, this is what we do. And my initiation, incidentally, into space sector started with my boss asking this very question: can you define the space value chain to begin with, right? There are 2-3 aspects to it, right? Number one, there is a clear distinction between space sector and space economy. I think as an ecosystem, we need to accept and agree to it, right? They're not the same, right? Space sector is a lot more easier to define. You have your upstream, downstream distinction there, and plenty of global literature to support how to measure it and enumerate. And it's simple enumeration, right? As a country, we, a high functioning economy from paddy to semiconductors, we measure all outputs. So it's fairly straightforward, and kudos to InSpace for the initiative, because the National Industrial Code-based enumeration and counting is much needed for the sector. I think NIC 2025 has some 3-4 codes that are related to space, and if there are 137 activities that has been enumerated under it, then that's fantastic, because you get a clear baseline there, and upstream and downstream gets a lot more easier to count and define, and that baseline becomes the most important thing on which you can build out all these models, right? Where it gets a little trickier, or I would say there's really no lack of consensus, is once space sector converges or moves into the space economy side of things, right? Two broad strokes there. One, what we have found, and that's our thesis, is that one is the derived services out of space, right? In sectors that are not related to space. How do you then count that value? Does it get measured here, or should it get counted in biotech or medtech and those relevant sectors? Because you can't have double counting in GDP. It's just not right? So that's one area where there's really no clear consensus, and I'm pretty sure European and American geographies also, they are dabbling with the same things, but they do have strong frameworks around as to how to govern it, right? And the second bit is where a lot of space-enabled services have a public good nature to it, right? 5 meter and above data is, it's public good. And once it becomes public good, and once it's enabling a lot of services, whether it's forest watching or whether it's navigation, whether it's comms, it becomes very tricky to measure that in terms of straightforward revenue accounting, right? It will not give you the right results. So that's where what I believe a logical extension, and it's a pure economic question, right? You need an input-output table for the sector. India has it for a lot of sectors. From simple agricultural crops, we have an input-output table. And eventually, I hope that InSpace's exercise will move towards that, where we can have a lot of these things quantified. In terms of that, then becomes the easiest way to, or a more acceptable way to measure the output of space-enabled sectors as well, right? So it has a public good concept to it, and that public good concept needs to be quantified correctly. And if that quantification doesn't happen with an acceptable framework, then we will be committing the cardinal sin of overestimating, right? To avoid that, if we have these frameworks correct, I think pretty sure that India's economic landscape is more than capable of counting this and repeating it, and having the annual data put out there, and quite frankly, this is public data, right? Every sector has this, and it's wonderful that InSpace has kickstarted the initiative, and we'll be getting their data soon. So that's my 2 cents on the definitional challenges. Space sector is easy to define. The space economy gets a little tricky.
Right, perfect setting, Nakul. So I just wanted to follow up with you, Rainer. As he rightly pointed out, there is that difference in methodology across institutes, across countries, across the areas that are being considered. So even this difference happens when we are discussing the same market. I mean, would you agree, first of all? If so, what are these differences that drive these variations, and what is the lesson for policymakers to keep it in them? Is there a scope to develop more robust metrics in that case to ensure consistency? And over to you, Rainer.
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you to SIA-INDIA and Ganesh for inviting us to this Big Four panel. I think we're probably not as prominent as the other brand names, but certainly in space. Quick introduction: 150 professionals around the world in 10 offices, including Bangalore. We use our global methodologies anywhere where we work. Since over 30 years, we're measuring the space economy in different facets and in different granularities, and we clearly see there's a consistency, and we'll try to explain every time when we're changing the methodology slightly, but also we're explaining in every report on the first page where we were slightly wrong or too over-optimistic last time round. I think that's an important thing, to stay true to yourself in those activities. There are consulting approaches to say, what do you want to hear? We're going to tell you, give me your watch and tell you what you want to hear. I think for us as independent consultants, it's important to tell the truth, to tell the independent opinion about certain topics and put it into the cultural context and into the expectations. That's what we do worldwide. We survey numerous institutions and companies worldwide, and put it into our proprietary database every year, and the same people respond every year, and also use the aggregated data as the basis for their business planning, for their budget planning, and so forth. So we do certainly see a need here and there for adjustments in terms of methodology. We're seeing new facets of the space economy evolving. We will see in space energy, we'll see in orbit data processing, we'll see in space manufacturing, and these things more and more happening, but we'll see much more growth on Earth, much more on space-enabled economy, data economy, downstream activities happening. What we also see is we're taking a closer look at military space nowadays. Yeah? In the past, it was always a bit of a black box. We knew 2/3 of the American space economy, just to take an example, was the so-called black space, that nobody really knew what it was. A lot of SATCOM, a lot of things, part of GPS and so forth, but clearly I think everybody now is looking at more carefully how is this, because other countries are gearing up in unprecedented way in military or dual-use space to see what is the potential, how far are we behind, how much can we catch up, how much is China doing in this field, and so forth. I think those are the main dimensions, to look at what are the new dimensions. In the fine-tuning, I think we stick to our methodology that is proven over 30 years.
Right. Thank you for that, Rainer. Himanshu, now on the question of $1 trillion, I mean, rather than the number, I think it's equally important to understand the story behind these numbers. So what do you think are the key assumptions underlying these projections? Again, you know, I'm picking from both of their answers. So anything that you believe is vulnerable to change here as we go forward?
So in the tradition, thank you very much, first of all, to all of you for listening to us, to SIA-INDIA for inviting me for this thing, and thank you, Ganesh, for conducting this. So I think in consulting, we follow one adage, which is like, your projections are only going to be as good as your assumptions. If your assumptions are wrong, your projections are going to be wrong. So I think this is a great question, and this is something that we need to look at. So I think there are 3 or 4 major assumptions that we see here. One is that one of the major chunk of the launch side is something that we have been seeing, that the launch costs are going down over the last few years. And the number of launches, of course, then has been increasing. Now, what we have to also understand is that this trend has to continue for the next, say, 10 odd years for us to be able to hit that $1 trillion number. So that is one part. Now, this is one of the core assumptions. Launch costs continue to go down and the number of launches increase year on year. Then the contribution to the economy that is expected out of the launch segment is going to be met. That is one part. The second part is, and Rainer has projected 7.8% growth for the space economy globally. So 7.8% growth rate, if it continues, it is only then that we are going to meet this number, right? So estimations are that this growth rate could be anywhere between 7 to 9% over the next 5 to 10 years. So let's hope it does not fall down below 7%, because if it does, then the numbers are going to get hit. And then maybe not by 2035, we may hit the number maybe a couple of years later. So that is the other assumption, I think, which is important. The third assumption also is to look at now the satellite broadband thing. Now, if you see, Starlink has gained a lot of traction in the last couple of years since its launch. We are also seeing a lot of other companies coming into the satellite broadband thing. But mostly it was being used as backhaul networks till now. That is what we have seen. Now, we also maybe need to understand this, that this broadband story coming out of the LEO has to scale. I think Starlink has added some 4.6 or 4.5 million users last year. But again, they have also kind of acknowledged, SpaceX themselves have acknowledged this, that this story is also going to kind of peak out when it comes to the launches and the satellite broadband story. So in 25, 26, in fact, the years that they're saying this is going to peak out. So what is the next best thing that they're going to do? They are going to look at the Starship program, which is again one of the major things going to be, the future of space travel and all. So if this transition does not happen correctly, then maybe again there is a big dent that could be caused into this thing, because the LEO broadband story is going to kind of subside a bit there. The fourth thing that we also see is, and that is exactly the point which Nakulan also made, and I completely agree with that. As of now, anything which is enabled by space, all the applications that we are running downstream on the ground, which are using space data, are also in a way invariably getting counted as part of the space economy. And this is a large chunk. We all know that now the launches are only comprising about 35 to 40% of the overall space economy, and downstream is primarily the major chunk of that part, about 60% there. So if it is, I think it is more definitional than what also Nakulan said. So it is more about defining it correctly rather than looking at if there is a technological aspect there. So I think these are the four major areas I think are there. And like I said, the fifth one, it's not essentially an assumption. But then if you see 51% of the global launches are being done by SpaceX now. So we also have to see that angle. A lot of satellite broadband is also being now majorly run by Starlink. So we have to also see that. A lot is depending on one company performing. So I think that is something also that we need to see. If this transition from the satellite broadband and the Starlink story to the Starship program does not happen correctly for SpaceX, it will again have a big impact on the global space economy. I think these are the 4 or 5 major areas.
Yeah, thank you, Himanshu. That was as crisp as it can be. Now, Divesh, I wanted to pick on what he stopped about the first part of his comment, that is on the projection trap. Do you see this constant fist fight between this proven commercial market, for example, the SATCOM, what he mentioned, versus these anticipated future markets, which probably Rainer mentioned a lot about? So that definitely brings about issues in terms of measuring the contribution, employment potential, investments and productivity, right? So how do you think that's going to play out? How do you think the stakeholders should distinguish between a realistic growth forecast versus, let's say, an overly optimistic, expectations on this?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Ganesh. And, the answer here is basically something which, Nakul, Himanshu, Rainer, everyone has basically summarized. So when we talk about, $1 trillion space economy, I would say it's not just a number, it's a spectrum of definitions, right? And effectively what we're saying is, in terms of being realistic, when we say $1 trillion economy, if you talk about the core space sector, effectively you have to define what is the space sector, space economy. Upstream, downstream, midstream, achieving $1 trillion by, let's say, mid-2030s to early 2030s is possible. With, of course, what Rainer mentioned is the expected growth rate, 8%, 7%. But if you talk about some of the estimates which we see out there, it's about 1.8 trillion, if you see. But I think those estimates also bring in the fact that we are also trying to cover in some of the space-enabled wider economic impact. For instance, if you start measuring services which use GPS, as a part of the space economy, then what you're measuring is an internet economy, not a space economy. So if you bring in the number of services within the ambit of space economy, of course, the estimates, go a little haywire. So $1 trillion for the core space economy in the next 8 to 10 years, early to mid 2035, 2030 is quite possible. So that's the realistic number, and of course, the unrealistic would be, the higher measure, totally dependent upon, the estimates or the definition of space economy we use.
Thank you for that. I think, in the interest of time, probably, I would ask one question which all of you can pitch in. And then if there are any questions from the audience, we could take one or two. So this was one closing question which I had kept in my mind, So the question is, if you reconvene, let's say 10 years or 15 years from now, is there an assumption that you think that you believe will prove most accurate versus one which you would think to be more wrong, and you could even pitch in with an India POV. So let's do the rounds again. Nakulan, you can start.
hindsight. Hindsight is not a luxury, right? So, couple of things there, right? So, when we look at, when you want to cast the next 10-year picture, 15-year picture, on all of the points that all the panelists mentioned, right? There is a way in which I feel that maybe we have already crossed the $1 trillion mark, right? Simple example. Sentinel-2 and Landsat-8, right? One of the most widely used open source satellite data platforms, right? It's the European taxpayer and the American taxpayer money. It's still publicly available, right? Now, what's the value of that data, right? Quite a lot of applications and, all the space-enabled governance that we speak of is fueled by that, right? And the same applies to ISRO data as well, right? 5 meter and above, it's kind of given out free, right? Now, if you start putting a value to it, and there are ways to measure it, right? It's very simple to do you want the lake near your house to be cleaned up or not? It's a public good question. And there are ways to measure it and, put a value to that. If you go down that road, right, if you put a value to, things that we are already using now and which is actually being made available free of cost, like you mentioned, the GPS signals, do you start counting that into the economy? We can't do those things or we do those things, right? But that's a methodological or a definitional question that we need to answer. The moment we align on that, probably these numbers are going to change a lot, right? So in the Indian context then, is that what I would personally see is that, for all three segments, right, of Earth observation, communications, as well as navigation, right? Number one would be that can we, hit a higher triple-digit assets in orbit, right? We are not there, and companies are gearing up towards that. The constellation sizes, when you add up the business case that's being made by a lot of companies, will definitely cross a number of 500, 600 if it materializes, right? So that's one, bold prediction, and doing that, what we also feel is on Earth observation, we need world-class data products for India, right? The equivalents of the Sentinel Labs to be built from India, that would be an amazing thing to accomplish as a country in the next 5 to 6 years, because we don't have to think of the world. We have markets here for usage and products like that. And on comms and PNT as well, there are bold plans that companies are putting together. So that's the North Star to which I would want to project the sector towards as far as India is concerned. And the global valuation and the global size and everything, I'll come back to that, it's methodological consistency, and we genuinely do not have to adhere to any, we don't need a consensus globally, right? Because it's economic measurement. We'll have to adhere to what the government here is putting out as methodology for all sectors. And from that perspective, I think the NIC classification and the enumeration and counting that will happen across all the identified activities will give a strong baseline. And that baseline will be the guiding principle through which you can measure the economy consistently. And I think that's about it, that we do have the frameworks and the answers, and bold bets are being placed, and it will materialize, and that's the hope. Yeah.
Well, maybe you asked for extreme things that we underestimate or overestimate. So just a few wild bets. One thing is satellite communications and direct to device. I think it will be faster than we expect, that we will have data satellite communication just integrated in our smartphones, like roaming from one country to another, from one provider to another, and we don't see the difference anymore. And I think we see more and more cooperation between traditional earthly, mobile and terrestrial telecoms and SATCOM providers, and we'll see more of that to happen in the coming years. And I think the space industry has to get used to, hey, this is a higher scale business. Only 8-9 years ago, they were separate communities. Yeah, there was 2% of the global telecoms was SATCOM, but now it's maybe several global roaming providers, and you will not see any difference anywhere. Yeah? That's the one thing. And the other one I think we're underestimating right now is the cost reduction that we will see in space, because now serious industrialization is happening in space. In Germany, automotive suppliers who are running short of business in the traditional combustion engine business are gearing up for large-scale production and bringing their manufacturing know-how their automation know-how into this. So I think for larger constellation and so forth, there's going to be a numbers game coming up. And what is big toys for big boys, which was still large parts of the space business for unique satellites and so forth, is becoming a highly industrialized electronic, mechanic, whatever product, especially when it comes to satellites. And we see the same thing, serial production for rocketry. Yeah? So I think those are the things that we're underestimating and which will fuel and will also restructure the industry substantially.
Just to probe you further on that, what do you think of this, the exploration market, the Lunar, the Artemis programs and the asteroid programs and all? Are we somewhere rightly estimating them, or are we?
Well, I think some things depend on how the international cooperation continues in a more complex geopolitical environment. But clearly it will help us advance robotics. It will help us bring things forward. And India has been in a good position doing things like that. So that will certainly propel us further. But it will take a while until we've got fuel stations in space and so forth. But again, those things, that economy is not driven by wanting to clean up space from an environmental perspective. Unfortunately, satellite approach, satellite inspection and so forth is first and foremost driven by military desires, military needs or military ambitions. Yeah? I'd love to point you to a document we recently published, a white paper free of charge. It's about refueling as the key for sovereignty in space, so to speak, and superiority in space. Yeah? If you want to protect yourself against satellites dancing around you and possibly blinding your satellite, you have to be able to refuel your satellite eventually.
So Ganesh, pardon me if my answer deviates a little bit from the core question, but then there are a couple of things I think we should also focus on. Is there is a large market in the defense also out there, right? Which I think in most of the conversations we are leaving out. And thankfully, the army people have all left, so I can say this freely. Sooner or later, you have to let the private sector get into, sovereign space also. We will have to do that. Without that, only with government funding and with government capability, where we are already aiming to, let ISRO become more of a research organization and do a large part of the manufacturing, etc., with the private sector. Sooner or later, you have to allow them to also start building for defense. Right, so that is one story I think we need to explore more, and it is going to be one of the major contributors to the space economy also. I don't think right now we are counting that as part of the overall space economy per se. So that is one thing. The second thing also is that when we talk of, say, platforms like what Copernicus is doing in terms of an EO data platform, or the accessibility of EO data, for example, to our private sector partners out here, I think it is still it's something that we need to do a little better on, if I can put it lightly. So that is something that we need to do. And I think it's a very good step that now the Indian government has taken of getting some private players onto developing this along with InSpace and with Department of Space. That's a good thing. But we have to also see, for the India story to grow here, we have to expand beyond our borders. So for example, why can't we have a platform where the other, the Indian, not only the Indian companies, even the foreign companies can actually plug in, right? So that accessibility is going to expand our market also. That is one part. The second part is, why can't we look at, let's say, Navik? Right now, we are only covering about 1,500 kilometers outside of Indian borders as of now. Can we not create a platform which is an equivalent of, let's say, US GPS? Can we do that? Can we also provide it at a very low cost, let's say, compared to what the US is giving today? And I mean, this purely is, economic banter. But then, can we look at something like that? Can we look at some new things that we need to do and open up our space more for the private sector, not only in India, but also abroad? And it will also give an opportunity to our Indian companies to actually start expanding their footprint globally, because we enable them with these kind of things. So I think these are the two things that I would say can be the good things that India can do. Yes.
So Ganesh, I'd probably get back to your, the core question. I would like to stick to, the assumption which is most likely to be wrong, because we've talking about the positives, right? The assumption itself, because the topic we're talking about is a $1 trillion economy. So as a, also a law graduate, I would like to question the very fact that, that saying that a $1 trillion economy is inevitable is something which is, a little incorrect. It is actually also conditional upon your business model viability instead of just technical capability. Because sooner or later you realize if there is no business model viability, you might reach $1 trillion. A decade hence, we'll also be talking about reaching a $2 trillion. So there you'll see the slow in the growth. And also when you talk about from India's perspective today where we stand, yes, the government investment definitely is something which is required. Private sector participation. And third, I think some of the most important aspect where we also see a lot of foreign satellite players, foreign companies coming to India is the demand creation capability.
Well, thanks a lot for that. I think we will have to summarize any questions from the, please go ahead, sir.
Great discussion. I just wanted to say a picture, broad picture, if you can paint, say 5 years hence. So space has really picked up in the last 2 years and all that. What would be the split, say, for communication on a scale of, say, 0 to 100? How much would be tourism that people want to go into space, Virgin doing that? And third is defense, which could be big because in the US-Iraq war, we saw that how important space is playing a role. So in 5 years, where could it be? What would be the split? Which will grow fast? Which will grow slow? So if you can throw some light on that.
Who wants to take it?
The three things that you spoke about, I think, like Rainer mentioned that a couple of years back, overall telecom, if you look at it, Satcom was 2% of it and not more than that, right? But given what's happening through NGSO constellation and Indian company also planning to launch GSO satellites, I think somewhere among the three things that you told, comms will pick up and there are...
Data is also getting into space,
sure.
yeah?
I'll come to that. So there are proven technologies, which is NGSO, GSO based satellite communications. We've done a lot of work on it and we're fairly confident that there is a market. There's a market in India, there's an underserved market, unserved market, and there's quite a possible growth trajectory that's possible there, and there are strategic requirements as well, both adding up together. That's one definitive growth area for the next 5 to 7 year window. We would see the Indian Satcom space pick up, right? That's one. And second on whether it's space tourism, lunar mining, asteroid mining, orbital data centers, there are theses that our companies are working on it. Whatever our interactions has been that let's reach a stage where some TRL levels are achieved, and once that's there, then that's a different cost to value equation that we are talking about, right? Because so far the thesis of space sector globally has been whatever goes up, you need to monetize it basis what you do back on Earth, right? But in orbit manufacturing, lunar mining, asteroid mining, space and biotechnology intersections, those are use cases in which you make money there, right? You bring something from here. So that's a very, very different cost to value equation. But once the TRL level reaches there, there could be a massive unlock there as well. But I
again, I think the major growth driver also for some of these more peripheral activities will be space defense and space military activities, driving the need and pulling the capabilities from approach to satellites, observation in space, which was not talked of 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, will drive these kind of critical capabilities, which later will enable, hopefully, if there's still space up there and it's not all full of debris, will hopefully be able to enable more of a space manufacturing, fuel depot, civilian business up there. Yeah, but I think space tourism and these type of things, I would not rate too highly at this time.
Well, we can probably take one more question if anybody. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
It's not a question, it is just a comment. You are being very pessimistic. Defense in India is, we have already opened up our arms. Okay. SBS 3, Ganesh will bear with me, 50% is private. Okay. So whatever gaps today I have, most of the gaps are being filled by the commercial imagery being taken from the private players. ISRO has done its work, whatever they have done. There are a lot of gaps still existing. So be very positive. Private industry is there and they are doing a great job. You have to go into the private industry to know how much they are doing. And it is the defense forces which have given up a lot of that government sectors to the private players. So we welcome, but you have to come with the right technology. That's the only thing.
I totally agree with you,
And
sir.
I hope Ganesh will agree with me, being in space.
Sir, the intention is not to say where exactly it is being done or not. I'm only saying to do this thing at scale, more participation is required, is what I'm saying. For example, the ground stations, even till today, the defense is not letting anybody else manage those ground stations. So that is there. The satellite control is completely today also with the defense services only. So, I mean, we can debate on this, sir.
Well, that was something which I had kept, that I'll speak when I conclude. So, sir, thank you for that. But yes, it's exactly, I mean, what you pointed out. I mean, but I would agree with you as well that there's scope for more to be done, which is what we are trying to do. In fact, I don't know if you have met AVM Court. He is in the other room within space, and that's one area which Court sir and team is driving. So I think we have run out of time. The anchor is already. Oh, your last question.
Hello.
Last one, yeah.
So good evening. I really enjoyed the discussion. It was quite an engaging and interesting one. So I had a question. So in 2023, InSpace declared that, like, we were at $8 billion in terms of the Indian economy. And InSpace declared that we will be reaching about $44 billion by 2033. So I wanted to know where are we currently, how far are we from the goal and the status of the same. Thank you.
Well, first of all, a small correction there. We are not saying we will be. We are saying we have to reach there. And there's a whole sea of difference between that. And all our programs are aligned towards that. Now, where are we? Informal estimates, but I would not want to quote it here. The whole point there is that's exactly the exercise that we are undertaking right now in a very formal way. So that's what I was mentioning about the NIC, which Nakulan and all of them did mention. So that's an estimate we are doing. In fact, we have one person identified to reach out to all the companies, and we need some basic data like your investment, number of employees, the stock, the initial stock, the final stock, the semi-finished stock, because what we do is from your revenue, we reach a size of the economy, and from this size of the economy and this variation in stock, we plug it with the GDP numbers, and we say that, look, space sector is contributing this percentage to the GDP, and that's where, you can actually get a concrete formal number in saying that we are achieving this target. But internally, I think we are well ahead of what we are projecting as of now, and I'm pretty confident that we will reach 44 or even beyond in the next decade. I mean, quite encouraged by the growth of the companies here. We had hardly 6 or 7 startups maybe 8 years ago. We have more than 400. We have had big companies getting contracts, export contracts from abroad. The MSMEs are coming up. In fact, right now in Bharat Innovate, which you might all be following, we have 16 companies from space sector, which probably is among the highest in terms of any number of companies. The recent RDI, Research Development Innovation Fund of 1 lakh crore, which was disbursed, a major chunk of it went to space sector companies. And so with the kind of push that the government is giving, with the kind of innovators that we are, I'm quite confident that we will reach this number. So one last question, but lunch.
I'm sorry, I wouldn't take a lot of time. So actually we talked about private companies into defense forces and space manufacturing. So my question is, if we are already delivering at a very elite level, our armed forces are already delivering things and our space companies are already delivering at an elite level, and currently seeing that we are going through a transition phase, even our armed forces are going through a highly transition phase. We are shifting from a backward military force, I wouldn't say backward, but we used to operate like old fighter jets, and now we are operating at a very high level position. So what brings in private companies in this transition? And even in Western countries, we have seen that data stealing with private companies is very common. even with Martin Baker and Lockheed Martin and all these companies, even though they provide at a very high level, but they aren't able to stop data stealing, because the motive at which they operate is not a nationalist motive, it is more like a capitalist motive. And so what helps the Indian military to have private companies at a very large scale when the military is already delivering what the public wants and our national security isn't being compromised?
So, totally agree with you, we can do that. But that statement was specifically in the context of making defense as part of the space economy in India. We don't want to do that as a country. I'm okay with that. Perfectly fine.
I think it was probably what Himanshu probably would have been taken out of context. And I agree with you, sir, that if you look at prior to 2023, so they've been NGP in place since 1999-2000, though less approvals. Came in 2023 policy. So we've seen the space sector opening up. To what extent we have to take a careful step. Defense, sovereignty, national interest, everything needs to be kept in mind. And I'm sure in space, keeps in mind all of those things when they give any permission for launches, for authorizations for, let's say, foreign satellite operators. So it's not about totally opening up everything in defense for private sector. Of course, we are already taking a stand. And for sure, national security comes first. It's just a way to what extent and when.
Maybe just one last sentence on the defense side of things. I'm leading the defense practice for Novaspace, and we're working with MODs, with system primes, but also with international alliances. What we're seeing right now is there's more and more joint ventures, corporations between defense primes and space companies, both startups and established primes. I think they realized it's a different game, it's a different likelihood. Often the military likes to buy stuff that works. They don't invest in R&D, yeah? At least in Europe this is the case. And they also realize that their industrial scale and their access to the customer and the trust that they have is relevant, and also to integrate space into land-based naval or airstrike solutions, yeah? So it's a system game where satellites are just a component of it, and ground systems and so forth. But even ground systems have to be mobile in the future more often, at least from a military requirement point of view. So new type of partnerships are happening to tackle the fast-growing demand from the military and defense.
Right. So I guess we'll stop here. We can all go for lunch. So thank you all. I hope you enjoyed the session. Please have your lunch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for a highly insightful session. I request the dignitaries to join us for a photograph, please. We'll break for lunch now.